In the unforgiving territory of No Man's Hollow, where the desert claims more dreams than it grants, a pregnant woman's simple act of courage would change 2 lives forever. Maybelle Quinn had nothing left to lose when she heard a stranger's desperate cries echoing from the treacherous salt flats. Armed with only a frayed rope and fierce determination, she risked everything to pull a mud-covered man from the hungry quicksand. What she didn't know was that the grateful stranger she saved was Weston Carrick, one of the wealthiest cattle barons in the territory. When he returned to her ramshackle homestead days later with a wagon full of supplies and an offer that seemed too good to be true, Maybelle faced an impossible choice. Could she trust the man whose life she'd saved to keep his word? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Morning sun crested the mesa like a judgment, casting long shadows across the cracked earth of No Man's Hollow. Maybelle Quinn stood at the edge of her front porch, one hand pressed against the small of her aching back, the other shielding her eyes as she surveyed the land that had become both her prison and her sanctuary. 6 months along now, her belly rounded beneath the faded blue dress that had once belonged to her mother. She moved with the careful deliberation of a woman who had learned that every step must be considered, every breath conserved. The homestead stretched before her in all its stubborn defiance, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support, much like the people who had once lived here. The main house, if it could be called that, was little more than a cabin with delusions of grandeur. Its roof sagged in the middle, where the winter snow had tested the ancient beams, and the windows were patched with oiled paper, where glass had given way to prairie winds. But it was hers, or would be if she could hold on to it long enough to prove her claim. She twisted the simple gold band on her finger, a habit she'd developed in the months since Thomas had left. The ring caught the morning light, a small defiance against the harsh reality of her situation. He'd placed it there 3 years ago in the church back in Kansas, promising her a life of adventure and prosperity as they joined the great western migration. The railroad was coming, he'd said, and they'd be ready for it. They'd stake their claim, build their empire, and grow old watching the trains carry commerce through their land. Thomas had been good at promises, less reliable when it came to keeping them. The sound of her boots on the porch boards echoed in the stillness as she made her way to the well. The rope groaned against the windlass as she drew up the bucket, the water dark and slightly bitter with alkali, but clean enough to drink. She'd learned to appreciate small mercies in this place, where everything had to be earned twice over, once from the land, and once from the elements that seemed determined to reclaim whatever the land grudgingly gave up. Her daily routine had become as fixed as the sunrise itself. Water first, then a careful inspection of the small vegetable garden she'd coaxed to life behind the house. The tomatoes were struggling, their leaves curled against the relentless sun, but the beans were thriving, their vines climbing the makeshift trellis Thomas had built before he'd decided that California gold was more appealing than Kansas soil. She picked what was ready, her movements economical and practiced, then moved on to check the rabbit snares she'd set along the creek bed. The creek ran year-round, a thin ribbon of water that had been the deciding factor in Thomas's choice of this particular plot. It was also the reason she'd been able to survive these months alone. The water meant wildlife, and wildlife meant the possibility of fresh meat to supplement the dwindling supplies in her root cellar. She'd learned to skin and clean whatever she caught, her city-bred squeamishness quickly overcome by the practical demands of survival. As she knelt beside the first snare, checking for signs of disturbance, she allowed herself a moment to remember. The woman she'd been before No Man's Hollow had claimed her. Maybelle Hartwell had been the daughter of a prosperous dry goods merchant in Topeka, accustomed to clean floors and regular meals, to Sunday services and social calls. She'd known how to play the piano and embroider pillow covers, skills that seemed as foreign now as speaking French. That woman had married Thomas Quinn with dreams of gentle adventure, of a life that would be challenging but rewarding. Supported by a husband's steady presence and the promise of a growing community, the woman who knelt in the dirt now, checking snares with calloused hands, was someone else entirely. She'd been forged by necessity and tempered by solitude, shaped by the daily fight against a land that offered no quarter to the weak or unprepared. The piano-playing girl was still there, somewhere beneath the sun-weathered exterior, but she'd learned to be quiet, to surface only in the evening hours when the day's work was done and the desert stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The snare was empty, but she'd expected as much. Game was scarce this time of year, when the heat drove most animals to seek shelter during the daylight hours. She'd try again at dusk when the rabbits emerged to feed. For now, she had beans and the last of the preserved peaches she'd put up the previous fall, and a sack of flour that would need to last another month if she was careful. Walking back toward the house, she paused at the small plot where she'd planted the prickly pear cactus she'd transplanted from the desert. The thick, paddle-shaped leaves were swollen with moisture, and she knew that in a few weeks they'd produce the deep red fruit that could be turned into jelly or eaten fresh. It was one of the many lessons she'd learned about survival in this harsh place, that the desert held its own abundance for those who knew how to look for it. The baby kicked then, a sharp jab against her ribs that made her catch her breath. She pressed her hand against the spot and felt the movement again, strong and insistent. It was a boy. She was certain of it, though she had no scientific reason for the conviction. Something in the way he moved, the determined quality of his protests when she'd been on her feet too long, reminded her of Thomas in his more optimistic moments. The thought brought both comfort and worry-comfort in the connection to the man she'd loved. Worry about raising a child who might inherit his father's restless spirit. She'd written letters to Thomas, of course, sent them to the last address he'd given her in Sacramento. But the silence that followed had been as vast as the desert itself, and she'd gradually stopped expecting replies. He'd find his fortune or he wouldn't, but either way, she and the baby would face whatever came next together. The ring on her finger had become less a symbol of marriage than a reminder of her own capacity for hope. Even when hope seemed foolish, the house felt cooler after the morning sun, and she moved through its familiar rooms with the efficiency of long practice. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor, dominated by the massive stone fireplace that would be essential come winter. Thomas had built it himself, working with methodical care to ensure it would draw properly and provide adequate heat for the entire house. It was perhaps the only part of the homestead that lived up to his ambitious plans, and she was grateful for his attention to detail every time the winter winds howled down from the mountains. The bedroom was small, but adequate, with a window that faced east to catch the morning light. She'd sewn curtains from materials salvaged from one of her good dresses, and the result was both practical and pleasing to the eye. The bed itself was a simple frame with a mattress stuffed with prairie grass and covered with quilts her mother had made. It was here that she'd spent the long nights of her first winter alone, listening to the coyotes howl and feeling the baby's first tentative movements, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake in choosing to stay. But where else would she go? Back to Kansas, to face her father's disappointment and the whispered gossip of her former neighbors? To California, to search for a husband who'd clearly chosen his freedom over his family? The homestead might be isolated and demanding, but it was hers in a way that no other place had ever been. Every improvement, every small victory against the elements, was something she'd earned through her own efforts. She prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, eating while standing at the kitchen window and watching the heat shimmer rise from the distant salt flats. It was there, in that treacherous stretch of alkaline mud and hidden springs, that she'd found the stranger 3 days ago. The memory still sent a chill through her, not from the rescue itself, but from the realization of how easily she could have lost her footing and joined him in the quicksand. The man Weston he'd said his name had been more shaken than he'd wanted to admit. She'd seen it in the way his hands trembled as he brushed the mud from his clothes, in the careful way he'd tested his footing before taking each step back to solid ground. He'd tried to pay her, of course, reaching for what looked like a substantial roll of bills before she'd waved him off. Money couldn't buy what mattered out here: knowledge, endurance, the kind of stubborn determination that kept you moving when everything else said to quit. Still, she found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering what had brought a well-dressed stranger to this remote corner of the territory. His clothes had been expensive, even under the coating of mud, and his speech had carried the polished cadence of education and privilege. Not the usual sort of man to find himself alone in no man's hollow, far from the main roads and established settlements. The afternoon heat was building, and she retreated to the shade of the porch to work on a quilt she'd started for the baby. The patterns were simple, mostly squares, and rectangles cut from fabric scraps, but the steady rhythm of the needlework soothed her mind and gave her hands something useful to do during the hours when outdoor work was impossible. She'd learned to embrace these quiet times, to find peace in the simple act of creating something beautiful and practical from whatever materials were available. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, she heard the sound that had become both blessing and curse, the rumble of wheels on the rough track that passed for a road. Visitors were rare enough that any approaching vehicle demanded attention, but they were also a reminder of how exposed and vulnerable she was in this isolated place. She rose from her chair, one hand on the porch railing for support, and shaded her eyes to make out the approaching figure. It was a wagon. She could see that much, pulled by a team of horses that looked well cared for and strong. The driver sat straight-backed on the seat, and even at this distance, something about his posture struck her as familiar. As the wagon drew closer, she felt her breath catch in her throat. It was him, the man from the Quicksand, looking considerably cleaner and more composed than when she'd last seen him. Weston Carrick had returned, and the wagon bed behind him was loaded with supplies. Weston Carrick brought his team to a halt, 20 yards from the porch, close enough for conversation, but distant enough to respect the boundaries that existed between strangers in this unforgiving country. He sat motionless for a moment, his hands resting on the reins, and Maybelle found herself studying him with the same careful attention she'd give to any potentially dangerous creature that had wandered into her territory. In the clear afternoon light, without the coating of mud and panic that had marked their first encounter, she could see him properly for the first time. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps 40, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of years spent outdoors, but under circumstances considerably more comfortable than her own. His clothes were well made, but practical, the kind of garments a successful man might wear when he wanted to blend in with working folk. But there was something in his bearing, a natural authority that suggested he wasn't accustomed to blending in anywhere. "Mrs. Quinn," he said, touching the brim of his hat as he climbed down from the wagon seat. His boots were expensive leather, she noticed, though dusty from travel. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, Mr. Carrick." She remained on the porch, her hands folded across her rounded belly, maintaining the physical distance even as her curiosity grew. "I didn't expect to see you again." "Neither did I," he admitted, and there was something in his voice that suggested the truth of that statement, surprised him as much as it did her. He gestured toward the loaded wagon. "I brought some supplies. Call it a thank you for what you did at the salt flats. I told you then, and I'll tell you now, thanks aren't necessary." But even as she spoke, her eyes were cataloging what she could see in the wagon bed. Flour sacks, what looked like canned goods, lumber, and other items covered by canvas tarps. More supplies than she'd seen in one place since leaving Kansas. "Maybe not necessary," Weston said, "but past due all the same." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a gold pocket watch, its chain catching the sunlight. The gesture seemed unconscious, the automatic movement of a man checking the time. But Maybelle caught a glimpse of engraving on the case before he returned it to his pocket. "A man doesn't often get pulled from quicksand by a woman in your condition. That's not something a person forgets." "Condition?" The word came out sharper than she'd intended, and she saw him wince slightly. "I meant no offense. What I'm trying to say is that you risked a great deal to help a stranger." Most people would have done exactly what I did," Maybelle interrupted. "Out here, you help when help is needed. It's not complicated." Weston was quiet for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Is it always that simple for you?" "Has to be. Complicated thinking is a luxury I can't afford." He nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd been wondering about. "Would you mind if I unloaded these supplies?" I've brought more than I can carry back, and it seems wasteful to let them go to ruin. Maybelle felt the familiar tug-of-war between pride and pragmatism that had become the defining struggle of her life in No Man's Hollow. Pride said to send him away, to maintain the independence she'd fought so hard to establish. But pragmatism, reinforced by the baby's movement against her ribs, whispered about winter supplies and the long months ahead when trips to town would become increasingly difficult. I don't take charity, she said finally. Good. I don't give. It? Weston moved to the back of the wagon and began untying the ropes that secured the canvas covering. This is a business transaction. You saved my life. I'm settling the debt. Fair exchange. And what happens when the debt is settled? You ride away, and I never see you again? That was the plan, he said, but something in his tone suggested the plan might be changing even as he spoke. She watched him work, noting the easy strength with which he handled the heavy sacks and crates. His hands were scarred but clean, the hands of a man who'd done physical work but hadn't been broken by it. When he pulled back the canvas to reveal the full extent of what he'd brought, she couldn't suppress a sharp intake of breath. There was enough flour to last through the winter, along with sugar, coffee, canned peaches, and other luxuries she hadn't tasted in months. But it was the lumber that truly caught her attention, good pine boards that could be used to repair the sagging roof or reinforce the walls against winter storms. And beneath it all, wrapped in oiled cloth, she could see what looked like tools. This is too much, she said, but her protest lacked conviction. It's exactly enough. Weston lifted a sack of flour as if it weighed nothing and started toward the house. Where would you like me to put this? You can't just... She started down the porch steps, then stopped as a wave of dizziness washed over her. The baby was riding high today, pressing against her lungs and making every breath an effort. Weston was beside her in an instant, his hand steady on her elbow. Easy there? When did you last sit down? I'm fine. But she allowed him to guide her back to the porch chair, grateful for the support, even as she resented needing it. When did you last see a doctor? His voice carried a note of genuine concern that surprised her. Doctors are a luxury out here, Mr. Carrick, like complicated thinking. There's a doctor in Millerville. Good man. Used to practice in Denver before. He came west. I could arrange. No. The word came out flat and final. I've managed this long on my own. Weston crouched beside her chair, bringing himself to eye level. Up close, she could see that his eyes were gray, like storm clouds, and that there were lines around them that spoke of years spent squinting against the sun. Mrs. Quinn Maybelle, you don't have to do everything alone. Don't I? The question hung between them, loaded with all the weight of her solitary months, all the fears she'd kept buried beneath the daily demands of survival. No, he said. Quietly. You don't. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The desert wind stirred the dust around the wagon wheels, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried as it rode the thermals above the mesa. It was one of those moments that seemed to balance on the edge of possibility, when the future could tip in any of several directions, depending on the next word spoken. Why? She asked finally. Why does it matter to you what happens to me and my baby? Weston was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 3 days ago, I was dying in that quicksand. Not just sinking, dying. I'd given up, stopped fighting, made my peace with it. And then I heard your voice telling me to grab the rope, telling me to hold on. You didn't just pull me out of the mud, Maybelle. You pulled me back from something a lot deeper than that. He stood abruptly, as if embarrassed by the admission, and returned to the wagon. I need to finish unloading before dark. Storm clouds building to the west. She looked where he pointed and saw them dark thunderheads piling up against the mountains, promising one of the violent summer storms that could turn the normally dry creek into a raging torrent within minutes. In her condition, she couldn't afford to be caught without adequate supplies if the storm knocked out the bridge or washed out the road. The root cellar, she said, making her decision. Behind the house, that's where the food store should go. The lumber can go under the overhang by the barn. Weston nodded and set to work with an efficiency that spoke of experience with physical labor. He didn't chatter or ask unnecessary questions, just moved steadily from wagon to storage areas, organizing the supplies with a practical eye for what would be needed first. Watching him work, Maybelle found herself reassessing her initial impression. This wasn't a soft city man playing at frontier life. This was someone who understood both comfort and hardship, who'd made choices that led him far from whatever privileged world had shaped his early years. As he carried the last of the supplies to the root cellar, the first fat raindrops began to fall, each one raising a small puff of dust from the parched earth. The storm was moving fast, the way they did in this country, and within minutes the scattered drops had become a steady downpour. "You'd better come inside," Maybelle called from the porch. "This one's going to be a soaker." Weston hesitated, clearly weighing the impropriety of entering an unmarried woman's home against the practical necessity of shelter. The decision was made for him when lightning split the sky overhead, followed immediately by a crash of thunder. That made the windows rattle. "Just until it passes," he said, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. "Just until it passes," she agreed, though something in her chest whispered that this storm might be the kind that changed everything in its wake. The rain drummed against the roof with increasing intensity, each drop a small percussion in the yards. Symphony of the summer storm. Inside the modest cabin, Maybelle busied herself preparing coffee, grateful for the simple ritual that gave her hands something to do while her mind grappled with the strange turn her afternoon had taken. Weston stood near the window, watching the water cascade from the eaves, his presence filling the small room in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. "I should warn you," she said, measuring coffee grounds with careful precision. "It's not the quality you're probably accustomed to. I stretch it with chicory root to make it last longer. I've had worse." He turned from the window, and she caught him taking in the details of her home, the careful mending on the curtains, the way she'd arranged the few pieces of furniture to maximize both function and comfort, the small touches that marked this as a place where someone had worked hard to create beauty from very little. "Somehow I doubt that." She poured the hot water over the grounds, inhaling the familiar aroma that always reminded her of better times. "You carry yourself like a man who's used to having things the way he wants them. Things, maybe, people know." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. "I've never been particularly good with people." "You seem to be managing well enough at the moment." Weston accepted the cup she offered, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. His hands were warm despite the cooling air from the storm, and she found herself noticing details she hadn't observed before: the calluses that spoke of real work, the old scar across his knuckles, the careful way he held the cup as if it were made of fine china rather than sturdy crockery. "Tell me about the land situation out here," he said, settling into the chair across from her small table. "I noticed some markers on my ride, and that suggests disputed claims." Maybelle's expression hardened. "You noticed correctly. The Hartwell spread to the east has been pushing boundaries ever since old man Hartwell died last winter. His son, Jake, seems to think that a woman alone can't hold a valid claim. Can you? Legally, I mean. As long as I can prove residence and improvement for the required period. The baby complicates things. Some folks think a woman in my condition can't fulfill the physical requirements of homesteading." She sipped her coffee, studying Weston's reaction. "But the law is the law, and I've got witnesses to my improvements and continuous residence." "What kind of pressure has this Jake Hartwell been applying?" The question was asked casually, but Maybelle sensed the steel beneath it. "Nothing I can't handle. Cut fences, blocked access to the creek a few times, that sort of thing. He's testing to see how much I'll tolerate before I pack up and leave. And if you won't be intimidated, then I expect the pressure will escalate." She met his gaze directly. "But this is my land, Mr. Carrick. I've bled for it, sweated for it, and I'll be damned if I'll let some spoiled rancher's son chase me off because he thinks pregnant women don't belong in the territory." Weston was quiet for a moment, turning the coffee cup in his hands. When he looked up, there was something different in his expression, a calculation that hadn't been there before. "What if you had backing?" Financial support, legal representation. That sort of thing? From who? From someone who understands the value of good land and the importance of standing up to bullies. Maybelle felt a familiar wariness creep up her spine. And what would this theoretical someone expect in return? A fair partnership, shared investment, shared risk, shared profits. I don't have anything to invest except the land itself. The land is enough, more than enough, if my assessment is correct. Weston leaned forward slightly, and she could see the businessman in him emerging. This territory is about to change, Maybelle. The railroad expansion, territorial government, statehood, everything's shifting. People who position themselves correctly now will reap the benefits for generations. And people who trust the wrong partners will lose everything they've worked for. Yes, he said simply. They will. The honesty of the response surprised her. She'd expected reassurances, promises that there was no risk involved. Instead, he was acknowledging the reality of what he was proposing, a gamble with stakes higher than she'd ever played for. Why me? She asked. You could partner with any number of established ranchers or business owners. Why offer this to a pregnant woman living hand to mouth on a homestead claim? Because you saved my life without asking what was in it for you. Because you've already proven you can survive in conditions that would break most people. And because... He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Because I think we might understand each other. Before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the drum of rain on the roof. Weston was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with a fluid grace that suggested he was no stranger to potentially dangerous situations. Riders, he said quietly, coming fast despite the weather. Maybelle joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she recognized the lead horseman, Jake Hartwell, and two of his hands. Are they in the habit of paying social calls during thunderstorms? No. She moved away from the window, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. They're here because they saw your wagon. They want to know who's been talking to me. Is that a problem? It is if they think I'm planning something that threatens their interests. She looked at Weston, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since he'd arrived. The expensive clothes, the confident bearing, the casual way he'd talked about financial backing and legal representation. This wasn't just any grateful stranger. Who are you, really? The riders were at the door now, their horses' hooves splashing in the muddy yard. Jake Hartwell's voice carried clearly through the rain. Mrs. Quinn, we need to have a word. Weston reached into his vest and withdrew the gold pocket watch she'd glimpsed earlier. This time, she could see the engraving clearly. W.C. from Father, 1878, and below it, in smaller script, what looked like a family crest. He closed the watch with a soft click and returned it to his pocket. My name is Weston Carrick, he said quietly. I own the largest cattle operation in 3 territories, along with interests in mining, shipping, and railroad development. Jake. Hartwell's father used to work for me before he struck out on his own. The pounding on the door grew more insistent. Mrs. Quinn, open up. Maybelle stared at Weston, pieces of a larger puzzle suddenly clicking into place. You're not here by accident. No, he admitted. I'm not. And the quicksand was real, as was everything else I've told you. He moved toward the door, his entire demeanor shifting into something harder, more commanding. But I think it's time Jake Hartwell learned that you're not as alone out here as he assumed. Wait. Maybelle caught his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric of his shirt. If you're who you say you are, getting involved in my problems could complicate things for both of us. Let me worry about complications. His smile was sharp-edged and entirely without humor. I've been handling Jake Hartwell and men like him since before you were born. This should be interesting. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by the murmur of voices as the men outside seemed to reconsider their approach. Weston straightened. His vest checked his pocket watch one final time and moved toward the door. Stay behind me, he said quietly. And whatever happens, remember you're not alone anymore. Weston opened the door with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to being in control, and Maybelle watched Jake Hartwell's expression shift from aggressive certainty to something approaching confusion. Jake was younger than Weston by a decade, with the soft features of someone who'd inherited his position rather than earned it. But he carried himself with the bluster of a man who'd never been seriously challenged. "Gentlemen," Weston said pleasantly, as if he were greeting guests at a social gathering rather than confronting men who'd ridden through a thunderstorm to intimidate a pregnant woman. Quite a storm to be out riding in. "We're here to speak with Mrs. Quinn," Jake said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "Private business." "I'm afraid that's not possible. Mrs. Quinn is indisposed at the moment, and as her business associate, I'll be handling any concerns you might have." Business associate. The term hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Maybelle could see Jake struggling to process. She remained in the doorway behind Weston, close enough to hear every word, but positioned so that his broader frame provided both physical and psychological protection. Business associate? Jake's laugh was forced. What kind of business could a woman in her condition possibly be conducting? "The kind that's none of your concern." Weston's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath now, a quiet authority that made Jake's bluster seem juvenile by comparison. "Though I understand you've been having some boundary disputes. Perhaps we should discuss those." "Who the hell are you?" one of Jake's companions demanded, a lean man with the permanently squinted eyes of someone who spent his life looking for trouble. Weston reached into his vest and withdrew a leather card case, extracting a business card with the deliberate precision of a man who knew the effect it would have. He handed it to Jake, who glanced at it and went visibly pale. "Weston Carrick," Jake said slowly, as if testing the name on his tongue. "Carrick Enterprises. You knew my father, I believe. Good man, from what I remember of him. Honest, hard-working, knew his place." The words were delivered without malice, but their implication was unmistakable. "I trust you've inherited his better qualities." Jake's face flushed red above his beard. "My father worked for himself, built his own spread from nothing, with a loan from Carrick Enterprises secured by this very property, which he repaid in full before his death. Admirable man, truly." Weston glanced at the other two riders, and back at Jake. "I assume you're not here to discuss old times, though. What seems to be the problem?" "There's been some confusion about boundary lines Mrs. Quinn's been allowing her stock to graze on disputed land." Maybelle started to protest, but Weston raised a hand slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both patience and warning. "Disputed by whom?" "The Territorial Survey Office has very clear records of all legitimate claims in this area. Survey records can be wrong. They can be. But in this case, they're not." Weston stepped fully onto the porch, and Maybelle noticed that the movement put him in a position where he could reach the rifle she kept propped beside the door if necessary. "I've had my own surveyors check the boundaries. Mrs. Quinn's claim is entirely valid and properly documented." "Your surveyors?" Jake's voice cracked slightly on the words. "I have an interest in ensuring that property rights are respected in this territory. Bad for business when legitimate claims are threatened by." Weston paused, as if searching for the right word. "Misunderstandings." The three men exchanged glances, and Maybelle could see them reassessing the situation. What had seemed like a simple intimidation visit had suddenly become something far more complex and potentially dangerous to their own interests. "We'll be checking those survey records ourselves," Jake said finally, trying to salvage some authority. "From the encounter, of course. I'd expect nothing less from concerned neighbors." Weston's smile was all politeness and no warmth. "I'm sure you'll find everything in order. And gentlemen, Mrs. Quinn is under my protection now. I trust that any future concerns about boundaries or livestock will be brought to my office in town, rather than discussed during nighttime raids on a lady's property." The word protection seemed to echo in the rain-soaked air, carrying weight that went far beyond its simple meaning. Jake opened his mouth as if to argue, then apparently thought better of it. "This isn't over," he said, but the threat sounded hollow even to Maybelle's ears. "No," Weston agreed amicably. "I don't suppose it is. Good evening, gentlemen. Safe ride home." The three men wheeled their horses and rode off into the storm, their retreat considerably less dramatic than their arrival. Weston remained on the porch until their hoofbeats faded into the distance, then stepped back inside and closed the door. "Well," Maybelle said after a moment, "that was illuminating. I'm sorry you had to see that. Jake Hartwell is a small man, trying to play a big man's game." Weston moved to the window again, watching until he was satisfied the riders were truly gone. "And you? What kind of game are you playing?" He turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before, a weariness that spoke of years spent in conflicts like the one they'd just witnessed. "The same one I've been playing for 20 years. The only difference is that now I have a reason to win beyond simple profit." "Which is, you?" The word came out quietly, almost reluctantly, as if he hadn't meant to say it aloud. Maybelle felt her breath catch. "Mr. Carrick, Weston. And before you say whatever you're about to say, let me finish." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threads beginning to show in his dark hair. "I know this is complicated. I know you don't fully trust me yet, and I know my timing is terrible. But what I told you about that quicksand was true. You didn't just save my life. You reminded me that there are still people in this world worth fighting for. I'm not some charity case that needs rescuing. No, you're not. You're the strongest person I've ever met, and you're carrying a child who deserves to grow up on land that his mother earned through her own sweat and determination." Weston reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "I had my lawyer draw this up while I was in town getting supplies. It's a partnership. Agreement, equal shares, with provisions for your child's inheritance regardless of what happens between us." Maybelle stared at the papers, afraid to touch them. "Equal shares in what?" "Everything. The land, future development, whatever profits we can generate. You're not getting charity, Maybelle. You're getting the partnership you've earned." Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, the thunder moving off toward the eastern mountains. But inside the small cabin, Maybelle felt as if a different kind of storm was just beginning, one that might reshape her life as thoroughly as the spring floods reshaped the creek bed. "I need time to think about this." "Of course. But while you're thinking, consider this. Jake Hartwell isn't going to give up just because I showed him a business card. Men like him don't back down until they're forced to, and forcing them requires resources you don't have alone. Asterisk. And if I agree to this partnership, what exactly would it mean? Day to day, I mean." Weston smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, it seemed entirely genuine. "It means you'll have help with the harvest, skilled hands to repair what needs repairing, and someone to share the load when the baby comes. It means you'll never have to face men like Jake Hartwell alone again. And what do you get out of it? A chance to build something that matters. A chance to be the kind of man my father raised me to be, instead of the kind of man business has made me." He paused, then added quietly, "And maybe, if I'm very lucky, a chance to earn the regard of a woman who's shown me what real courage looks like." The baby chose that moment to deliver a sharp kick to Maybelle's ribs, as if offering his own opinion on the matter. She pressed her hand to the spot, feeling the strong, insistent movement of new life, demanding to be considered in whatever decision she made. "The cradle," she said suddenly. "I'm sorry?" "In your wagon, under that canvas tarp, I saw what looked like a hand-carved cradle." Weston had the grace to look embarrassed. "You have sharp eyes. Sharp enough to know that you didn't just decide to help me this afternoon. You've been planning this for days." "Planning to help, yes. Planning how you'd respond, no." He gestured toward the papers still clutched in her hands. "Those documents are real, Maybelle. The offer is real. But so is your right to refuse it." She looked down at the partnership agreement, its formal language promising things she'd never dared to hope for: security, equality, a future where her child would inherit something more than just debt and hard-won survival skills. "I'll read this tonight," she said finally. "Give you an answer in the morning. That's all I can ask." Weston moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I hope you say yes. I think we could build something remarkable together." After he left, riding back toward town through the clearing storm, Maybelle sat at her small table and read every word of the partnership agreement by lamplight. Outside, The creek sang with new water, and in the distance she could hear the night sounds of the desert coming back to life after the rain. The cradle sat on her porch where Weston had left it, a beautiful piece of work crafted from pine and finished with the kind of care that spoke of hours spent in patient labor. Inside it was a small quilt, hand-stitched in patterns that reminded her of the ones her own mother had made dot as she traced the smooth wood with her fingertips. She realized that her answer had been made the moment she'd seen Jake Hartwell's face when Weston had introduced himself. This wasn't just about partnership or protection. It was about choosing to believe that some people still kept their word, that some offers came without hidden strings, and that sometimes rescue could flow both ways. 3 weeks after signing the partnership agreement, Maybelle woke to the sound of hammers and the low murmur of working men's voices. The morning sun streamed through her bedroom window, carrying with it the scent of fresh-cut lumber and the promise of changes that were still taking shape in her mind. She dressed carefully, her expanding belly making even simple tasks more challenging, and made her way to the kitchen where coffee was already brewing in a pot she didn't remember setting up the night before. Through the window, she could see Weston directing a crew of 6 men as they raised the frame for what would become a proper barn. The sight still struck her as surreal after months of solitary struggle. Her homestead had become a hub of purposeful activity. The workers moved with the efficient precision of men who knew their trade, and at the center of it all, Weston, commanded with quiet authority that brooked no argument but inspired no resentment. "Morning, Mrs. Quinn." The voice belonged to Miguel Santos, Weston's foreman, a compact man with graying temples and hands that spoke of decades working with tools and timber. He'd appeared at her door a second day of construction, hat in hand, to apologize for the early morning noise and to assure her that his men would be respectful of her privacy and property. "Good morning, Miguel. The coffee smells wonderful." "Mr. Carrick's instructions said a lady in your condition shouldn't have to worry about breakfast preparations when there's construction work disturbing her rest." Miguel's English carried the musical cadence of his native Spanish, and his smile was warm with genuine respect. "There's fresh bread in the basket there, and Maria, that's my wife, she sent preserves from her own kitchen." Maybelle accepted the offered breakfast with a mixture of gratitude and unease that had become familiar over the past weeks. Every kindness, every thoughtful gesture seemed to push her further into debt to a man who insisted he wanted nothing more than fair partnership. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that Weston Carrick was accustomed to getting his way through a combination of generosity and subtle pressure that made refusal seem churlish. "How's the work progressing?" she asked, joining Miguel at the window to watch the barn raising. "Better than expected. Your land is good for building solid foundation, good drainage. Mr. Carrick chose well when he decided to invest here." "He told you this was an investment?" Miguel glanced at her with curious eyes. "Isn't it? He speaks of this place like a man, planning for the long term. Talks about crop rotation, water management, expanding the herd. These are not the plans of someone thinking about quick profit." Before Maybelle could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Jake Hartwell had arrived with 2 companions, but these weren't the same men who'd accompanied him during the stormy confrontation. These were harder types, with the look of men who settled disputes with something other than words. Weston moved toward the visitors with measured steps, and Maybelle noticed that his workers continued their tasks but positioned themselves where they could respond quickly if trouble developed. Miguel murmured something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer and moved toward the door. "Stay inside, Mrs. Quinn. This is business that men should handle." "It's my land they're arguing about," she protested, but Miguel was already outside, and she was forced to watch through the window as Jake dismounted and approached Weston with obvious anger. "I've done some checking on you, Carrick." Jake's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "Seems you've been buying up a lot of property in this territory lately. Makes a man wonder what you know that the rest of us don't." "I know that good?" "Land is always a sound investment," Weston replied calmly. "I also know that intimidating pregnant women is poor form, regardless of the circumstances. That woman's claim is fraudulent. No single woman can fulfill the improvement requirements, especially not in her condition. Mrs. Quinn has fulfilled every legal requirement for her homestead claim. I have the territorial surveyor's report to prove it. Weston reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. Would you care to review it? Jake waved the papers away. Surveys can be bought, same as anything else. What can't be bought is the right to disrupt established operations for the sake of some Eastern Railroad scheme. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke, and Maybelle felt her chest tighten. Eastern Railroad scheme. The words explained so much: Weston's interest in the land, his confidence about future profits, his willingness to invest so heavily in what appeared to be a struggling homestead operation. I'm not sure what you're implying, Weston said, but Maybelle caught a slight stiffness in his posture that suggested Jake had struck closer to home than expected. I'm implying that you're speculating on railroad development, buying up land along the projected route, and using that woman as a front to acquire property you couldn't get any other way. Jake stepped closer, his voice rising. I'm implying that when the railroad comes through, you'll own everything from here to the territorial line, and the rest of us will be left with nothing. And if that were true, what would you propose to do about it? The question was asked quietly, but there was something in Weston's tone that made Jake's companions shift nervously in their saddles. These were dangerous men, but they recognized something even more dangerous in the cattle baron's controlled stillness. I propose that you find another route for your railroad. This territory has been good to the people who built it, and we're not planning to step aside for some Eastern corporation's profit margins. The railroad will go where the railroad needs to go, Weston said. That's not a decision for either of us to make. But I'll tell you what is, whether this conversation ends peacefully or becomes something more serious. Miguel had been joined by two other workers, and Maybelle noticed that all three had positioned themselves within reach of tools that could serve as weapons if necessary. The morning's atmosphere of productive cooperation had shifted into something much more volatile. You think your hired hands scare me? Jake laughed, but the sound was forced. I've got 20 men on my spread who know how to handle troublemakers. I'm sure you do. But those 20 men aren't here right now, and even if they were, this is still Mrs. Quinn's property, and she's still under my protection. Weston pulled out his pocket watch, checked the time with deliberate precision, and returned it to his vest. I think this conversation has run its course. Jake looked from Weston to the workers, then toward the house where he knew Maybelle was watching. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold promise of a man who'd been backed into a corner. This isn't over, Carrick. Not by a long shot. No, Weston agreed. I don't suppose it is. After Jake and his men had ridden away, Weston came to the house and found Maybelle waiting for him in the kitchen. She'd heard enough of the conversation to understand that the stakes had just increased dramatically, and she had questions that demanded honest answers. Eastern Railroad scheme, she said without preamble. Is he right? Weston poured himself coffee from the pot Miguel had prepared, taking time to consider his response. When he looked at her, his expression was troubled but not defensive. There are railroad development plans for this territory. That's no secret. The territorial government has been promoting expansion for years. What Jake doesn't know is the specifics of the route surveys or the timeline for construction. But you do. I have access to information that others don't. Yes. That's part of what business success requires in this country, knowing things before your competitors do. And my land? Is it in the path of this railroad? Weston was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if the answer might be written in the dark liquid. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession. The proposed route runs directly through your property, not just across one corner, but through the heart of it. When the railroad comes, this homestead will be worth 50 times what it is today. Maybelle felt the baby shift inside her, as if responding to her sudden surge of mixed emotions. Anger at being deceived, warred with a practical understanding of what Weston's revelation meant for her child's future. So Jake was right. You are using me as a front to acquire railroad land. No. The word came out sharp and definitive. I'm protecting you from men who would force you off this land for a fraction of its true value, then sell it to the railroad for enormous profit. The partnership agreement we signed gives you equal ownership of whatever this property becomes. Worth. If I were using you, would I have structured the deal that way? She had to admit he had a point, but the feeling of being manipulated, even for her own benefit, left a bitter taste in her mouth. What else haven't you told me? Nothing that affects your interests or your safety. But there are things about my business dealings, my family situation, that I've kept private. Not because I don't trust you, but because they're complicated, and I wasn't sure how much you wanted. To know. I want to know everything. If we're partners, if I'm trusting you with my child's future, then I deserve to know exactly who I'm dealing with. Weston nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this conversation and dreading it in equal measure. All right, but you might not like what you hear. Try me. He reached for his pocket watch again, and stopped himself with a rueful smile. My father built Carrick Enterprises for nothing, but he paid a price for that success. He was ruthless. When he needed to be, loyal to those who earned it, and absolutely unforgiving toward anyone who crossed him. When he died, he left me a business empire and a reputation that opens doors, but also makes enemies. What kind of enemies? The kind that would see sabotaging a pregnant woman's homestead claim as a reasonable business tactic. The kind that view violence as just another tool for getting what they want. Weston met her eyes directly. My brother is one of them. The revelation hit Maybelle like cold water. Your brother, Marcus Carrick? He inherited our father's business. Sense, but none of his ethics. We've been at odds for years over the direction of the company, and recently those disagreements have become personal. Personal how? He believes I've gone soft, that I'm letting sentiment interfere with profit. He's probably right about the sentiment part meeting. You has reminded me that there are things more important than money. Weston's voice grew quiet, but he's wrong about the rest. I haven't gone soft. I've just remembered what I'm fighting. Four. Outside, the sound of hammers resumed as the work crew returned to their tasks. But inside the kitchen, Maybelle felt as if everything she thought she knew about her situation was shifting like sand in an earthquake. The partnership she'd signed, the protection she'd accepted, the growing feelings she'd tried to ignore, all of it was more complicated and more dangerous than she'd imagined. So when Jake Hartwell comes back with his 20 men, as we both know he will, it won't just be about boundary disputes and homestead claims. It'll be about railroad routes and business empires and family feuds I know nothing about. Yes, Weston said simply, it will be. Maybelle placed both hands on her rounded belly, feeling the strong, steady movement of the child who would inherit whatever came next. The decisions she made now would shape not just her own future, but the future of the next generation. Then we'd better make sure we're ready for them, she said finally, because I'll be damned if I'll let your family's business problems cost my child his birthright. Weston's smile was surprised and grateful. Our child's birthright. That's what partnership means, remember? Our child's birthright, she agreed, and for the first time since signing the agreement, the words felt entirely true. The leather journal lay open on Weston's desk in the small office he'd established in what had once been Maybelle's storage shed. By lamplight, his careful handwriting filled the pages with observations that had begun as business notes, but had gradually transformed into something far more personal. Tonight's entry wrestled with questions that had no easy answers, prompted by the afternoon's conversation with Maybelle about trust and partnership and the growing complexity of their arrangement. Day 23 of partnership. The barn frame is complete, and Miguel's crew will begin the roofing tomorrow. M showed remarkable composure during Hartwell's visit, though I could see the strain in her face afterward. She's stronger than she knows, but pregnancy takes its toll, and the added stress of our situation isn't helping. Need to find a way to resolve the Hartwell problem before it escalates further. She asked about my family tonight. Direct questions that deserved direct answers, though I found myself reluctant to burden her with the full weight of my complications with Marcus. How do you explain to someone whose greatest concern has been survival that your brother views human beings as chess pieces to be moved and sacrificed for strategic advantage? The truth is, I'm not sure I understand my own motivations anymore. What began as a business opportunity has become something else entirely. When I look at her, I see not just a partner or an investment, but a woman building something worthwhile. From nothing, creating a home for her child, with the same determination my father showed when he built our first ranch. There's a purity in her purpose that I'd forgotten was possible. Weston paused in his writing, listening to the night sounds of the desert and the distant murmur of the creek running full from recent rains. Through the small window, he could see the lights still burning in the main house, where Maybelle was likely working on the baby clothes she'd been sewing by evening lamplight. The image stirred something in his chest that he'd thought buried with his father, longing for the kind of life that built legacies beyond mere profit. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in." Maybelle entered carrying a steaming cup and wearing the heavy shawl she'd taken to draping over her shoulders during the cooling evening hours. Miguel's wife sent over some of that tea she recommended for helping with sleep. "Thought you might want some." "That's thoughtful, thank you." He accepted the cup, noting how their fingers brushed in the exchange and how that simple contact sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the tea. "You should be resting. It's late. So should you. I saw your light from the house." She settled into the chair across from his makeshift desk, moving with the careful deliberation that had become second nature as her pregnancy progressed. "What are you writing? Business notes? Project plans?" The deflection came automatically, but her raised eyebrow suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Business notes that require that much concentration? You've been out here every evening." This week, Weston closed the journal with a soft thud, recognizing that his attempt at privacy had been more transparent than he'd intended. "I've been thinking about the railroad situation, about what it means for the territory, for people like Jake Hartwell who've built their lives here. People like me, you mean?" "No, you're different. You came here knowing it would be difficult, prepared to work for whatever you could build." Hartwell inherited his father's spread and his father's attitudes about who belongs in this country and who doesn't. Maybelle sipped her tea, studying him with the direct gaze that still made him slightly uncomfortable. "You feel guilty about the advantage your information gives you." It wasn't a question, and her accuracy surprised him. "Shouldn't I? When the railroad comes through, everyone's life will change, but only a few people know enough to prepare for it properly. And you think you should share that information out of fairness? The thought has occurred to me. Even with men like Jake Hartwell, who would use it to force other people off their land." Weston was quiet for a moment, recognizing the trap in her logic. When you put it that way, it sounds simpler than it feels. Most moral questions do. But you're not responsible for other people's choices, Weston. You're only responsible for your own. She shifted in the chair, one hand moving to rest on her rounded belly. "The question isn't whether it's fair that you know things other people don't. The question is what you do with that knowledge. And what am I doing with it? Protecting a pregnant woman from men who would steal her land and leave her destitute. Building something that will benefit not just you, but everyone who works here and everyone who'll come after us." Her voice grew softer. "Giving my child a chance at a better life than I could provide alone." The baby chose that moment to kick, strongly enough that Maybelle winced slightly. Without thinking, Weston leaned forward. "Are you all right?" "He's just active tonight. Gets restless when I've been sitting too long." She rubbed the spot where the movement had been strongest. "Sometimes I think he's as eager to get started as I am anxious about what comes next. May I?" Weston gestured toward her belly, then stopped himself, realizing the impropriety of the request. "It's all right." Maybelle guided his hand to where the baby was moving, and Weston felt his breath catch as a strong kick connected with his palm. My God, he's strong. Strong and stubborn. Takes after his mother, according to Miguel's wife. She smiled, but there was something wistful in her expression. His father would have been proud. His father was a fool for leaving. The words came out more forcefully than Weston had intended, and he saw Maybelle's eyes widen slightly. "I'm sorry. I have no right to judge a man I never met." "No, you're right. Thomas was many things, but he wasn't reliable when reliability mattered most." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I used to think that made me a poor judge of character." Now I wonder if it just means I was young and believed in promises that were too easy to make. And now? Now I'm more interested in actions than promises. In what people do when things get difficult, rather than what they say when everything's going well. Weston kept his hand where she'd placed it, feeling the life moving beneath his palm and marveling at the trust implicit in her gesture. What? Do my actions tell you? That you're a man trying to figure out who he wants to be. That you care more about doing right than being right. That you're probably the most honorable person I've ever met, even if you don't see yourself that way. I've made decisions that cost people their livelihoods. I've used my advantages to gain more advantages, sometimes at the expense of people who couldn't fight back. And yet here you are, using those same advantages to protect someone who can't. Fight back. People change, Weston. Or maybe they just finally get the chance to be who they were meant to be all along. The baby kicked again, and this time Weston felt something shift inside himself, as if the child's movement had dislodged something that had been lodged in his chest for years. I never thought I'd want children. My father was so focused on business that I barely knew him as a person. My brother. He shook his head. Let's just say that family loyalty isn't something the Carrick men have traditionally excelled at. This child will know you differently. Will he? What if I'm too much like my father? What if business success is all I'm really good at? Maybelle covered his hand with both of hers, and he realized that somewhere in the past few minutes, the conversation had crossed a line they'd both been approaching cautiously for weeks. You're here, Weston. At 9 o'clock at night, in a converted shed, worried about fairness and responsibility, and whether you're good enough to be the kind of man a child should look up to. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of father you'd be. The weight of her words, the warmth of her hands on his, the movement of the child beneath their joined palms, it all combined into a moment of perfect clarity about what he wanted his future to look like. Not the empire his father had built, not the cold calculations that had driven his business success, but this, partnership with someone who challenged him to be better, responsibility for something that mattered beyond profit margins, the chance to build a legacy measured in more than money. Maybelle, he began, then stopped as the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the night air. She pulled her hands away, and he immediately missed the contact. Who would be riding out here this late? Weston was already moving toward the window, his body tensing as he recognized the purposeful cadence of multiple horses moving at speed. No one with good intentions. Stay here. Like hell I will. This is my property, and I have a right to know what's happening on it. Before he could argue, the riders were in the yard, and Weston could see by moonlight that there were more of them than he'd expected. 8 men, maybe 10, led by someone whose bearing suggested military training. This wasn't Jake Hartwell's usual crew of hired hands. This was something more serious and more dangerous. Mr. Carrick. The voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. We need to talk. Weston recognized the voice and felt his stomach drop. Marcus, your brother? Maybelle's voice was tight with alarm. My brother. Weston reached for the rifle he kept propped beside his desk, checking to ensure it was loaded. And if he's here with that many men, it means our family disagreement has just become something much more serious. Outside, Marcus Carrick was dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life on horseback. In the moonlight, the family resemblance was clear, the same height and build, the same commanding presence. But where Weston had learned to temper his authority with consideration for others, Marcus wielded his like a weapon. Time to find out exactly how serious, Weston murmured, then looked at Maybelle with an expression that mixed determination and regret. Whatever happens next, remember that the partnership agreement is legally binding. If something happens to me, you and the baby are protected. Nothing's going to happen to you, Maybelle said firmly, but her hand moved instinctively to rest on her belly, as if shielding the child from whatever was coming. I hope you're right, Weston said, and opened the door to face his brother's midnight visit dot in his journal, still open on the desk. The incomplete entry seemed to hang in the lamplight like a question waiting for an answer. The truth is, I'm not sure I understand my own motivations anymore. Marcus. Carrick stood in the moonlight like a darker reflection of his brother. his posture radiating the controlled aggression of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. The 8 riders who'd accompanied him remained mounted, positioned strategically around the yard, in a formation that spoke of military precision rather than casual ranch work. In the pale light, Maybelle could see that these weren't ordinary. Hired hands, they carried themselves with the disciplined bearing of professional soldiers. "Hello, brother." Marcus's voice carried across the space between them with the false warmth of a snake's smile. "Quite an operation you've built out here. Very domestic." Weston stepped fully onto the porch, the rifle held casually but ready. "Marcus, I can't say I expected a family visit at this hour. Time is a luxury we don't have anymore, thanks to your recent activities." Marcus gestured toward the completed barn, the neat rows of construction materials, the obvious signs of substantial investment. "You've been busy playing house while real business has been going to hell. What business would that be?" "Our business." "Weston, the business our father built, the business you seem to have forgotten in favor of." Marcus's gaze shifted to Maybelle, still visible in the doorway of the office shed. "Whatever this is," Maybelle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. Something in Marcus's tone suggested this confrontation involved more than simple family rivalry, and the military precision of his escort made her think of wars rather than business disputes. "Mrs. Quinn is my business partner," Weston said evenly, "and this property is legally protected under territorial law." "Territorial law?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "That's what I came to discuss with you, brother. It seems territorial law is about to become considerably more flexible." From his saddlebags, Marcus withdrew a thick document case and tossed it onto the porch boards at Weston's feet. "Railroad. Contract, signed and sealed. The Union Pacific has been granted emergency powers to acquire any property necessary for the completion of their transcontinental route. That includes the right to override existing homestead claims when strategic. Necessity demands it." Weston picked up the case, but didn't open it immediately. "Emergency powers granted by whom?" "By people who understand that individual property rights can't be allowed to interfere with national interests. The railroad must go through, Weston, and it must go through on schedule. Wars have been fought over less strategic advantage than a completed transcontinental rail line. Wars." Maybelle stepped out of the office shed, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her rounded belly. "What wars are you talking about?" Marcus's smile widened as he focused his attention on her directly for the first time. "Mrs. Quinn, isn't it? The widow with the questionable homestead claim?" "I'm not a widow, and there's nothing questionable about my claim." "No? How interesting. Because according to my research, your husband Thomas Quinn is very much alive and living quite comfortably in Sacramento with a woman named Elena Vasquez. Seems he's been supporting himself by selling false property deeds to unsuspecting railroad surveyors." The words hit Maybelle like a physical blow, and she felt the world tilt slightly around her. Thomas alive. Thomas alive, and not just absent, but actively profiting from her isolation and struggle. She gripped the doorframe for support, her mind racing through implications she wasn't ready to process. "That's impossible," she whispered, but even as she spoke, pieces of a larger puzzle began clicking into place. Thomas's sudden departure, his vague explanations about California opportunities, his failure to respond to her letters, all of it took on a different meaning. If he'd been planning an elaborate deception from the beginning, Weston was at her side immediately, his hand steady on her elbow as he helped her to the porch chair. "Even if that's true, it doesn't affect Maybelle's homestead claim. She's fulfilled all the legal requirements independently." "Ah, but it does affect it, brother. Because if Mrs. Quinn is still legally married to a man who's been defrauding railroad companies, then her property becomes subject to federal seizure as part of a criminal investigation." Marcus opened the document case and withdrew what looked like an official warrant. "I have authorization to impound this homestead pending a full investigation into Thomas Quinn's activities." "Federal authorization from whom?" Weston's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "From people who've grown tired of your interference in matters of national security. Did you really think your little homestead investment would go unnoticed?" Did you think we wouldn't figure out that you've been using inside information to corner the market on railroad development land? Maybelle looked between the two brothers, struggling to understand the full scope of what was happening. Inside. Information? Marcus pulled out another document, this one covered with official seals and signatures. Your partner, Mrs. Quinn, has been receiving advance copies of railroad survey reports, construction timelines, and route modifications directly from Federal Railway Commissioners. Information that should be classified until formal announcements are made. How? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Because our dear brother has been sleeping with the commissioner's wife for the past 2 years. Catherine Morrison has been passing him documents in exchange for, shall we say, personal considerations that her aging husband can no longer provide. The revelation struck like lightning, illuminating corners of Weston's character that Maybelle had never glimpsed. She turned to look at him, searching his face for denial, for explanation, for anything that would make Marcus's words untrue. It true? Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow. Weston's silence stretched long enough to become an answer in itself. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man confessing to crimes that had seemed reasonable, until spoken aloud. Catherine and I have had an arrangement, yes. Information in exchange for financial security that her husband's government salary couldn't provide. An arrangement. Maybelle felt something cold and final settling in her chest. All this time, when you talked about business instincts and market knowledge, you were talking about information you got from another man's wife. It's more complicated than that, is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you've been using me to legitimize land acquisitions based on information you obtained through adultery and corruption. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to her distress. How long have you known about Thomas? Maybelle, how long? Marcus answered when Weston remained silent. He's known since before he ever met you. Thomas Quinn's fraudulent activities have been under federal investigation for months. When Weston learned that the infamous Thomas Quinn had abandoned the pregnant wife on a potentially valuable homestead, he saw an opportunity to acquire the land through a front operation. A front operation. The words tasted like ashes in Maybelle's mouth. That's what I am. That's what this partnership has been from the beginning. No. Weston's protest came out fierce and immediate. Whatever it started as, that's not what it became. Maybelle, you have to believe me. I don't have to believe anything. Not anymore. She struggled to her feet, her movements made clumsy by pregnancy and the shock of betrayal. All those conversations about trust and partnership and building. Something together, was any of it real? All of it was real. My feelings for you, my commitment to our partnership, everything I've told you about wanting to be a better man, built on lies. All of it built on lies and manipulation and information you got from someone else's bed. Maybelle moved toward the house, each step an effort of will over the desire to simply collapse. I need you to leave. All of you, right now. Mrs. Quinn. Marcus's voice followed her, smooth and satisfied. I'm afraid that's not possible. As I mentioned, this property is now under federal investigation. No one leaves until the matter is resolved. She turned back to face him, and in the moonlight, her expression was terrible in its controlled fury. Federal investigation or not, this is still my home until a court says otherwise. And in my home, I decide who stays and who goes. Actually, Marcus smiled, pulling yet another document from his case. You don't. This is a federal warrant authorizing the temporary seizure of this property and all associated assets. As of right now, Mrs. Quinn, you're a guest in what used to be your own home. The warrant was real. Maybelle could see the official seals even from a distance. But more damaging than any legal document was the railroad contract Marcus had shown them earlier. She'd caught a glimpse of it when Weston had opened the case, and what she'd seen had turned her blood to ice. The route map showed the proposed railroad line running directly through her property, just as Weston had admitted. But it also showed something else, an alternate route that would bypass her land entirely, running through what looked like Jake Hartwell's spread instead. The choice of routes, it seemed, was still being debated at the federal level, which meant that everything, the partnership, the protection, even Jake Hartwell's aggressive attempts to claim her land, had been based on information that might not even be accurate. "There's an alternate route," she said quietly, the realization hitting her like cold water. Marcus's smile widened. "Very observant, Mrs. Quinn. Yes, there are several possible routes under consideration. The final decision will depend on a number of factors: cost, engineering challenges, local cooperation, that sort of thing. Local cooperation meaning who's willing to sell and who isn't. Among other considerations, yes." Maybelle looked at Weston, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since their partnership began. "You knew there were alternate routes, and you let me believe that my land was definitely going to be valuable. I believed it would be. The surveys you obtained through Catherine Morrison indicated what you wanted them to indicate." Marcus's voice carried the satisfaction of a man delivering a killing blow. "But surveys can be modified, Mrs. Quinn. Routes can be changed. And as it happens, recent geological studies have raised questions about the feasibility of the northern route through your property." "Geological studies that weren't mentioned in the documents you showed me," Weston said, his voice tight with realization. "Geological studies that were classified until this evening. Studies that suggest the southern route through the Hartwell spread would be significantly more cost-effective and engineering-friendly." Marcus returned the railroad contract to his document case with deliberate precision. "Studies that I commissioned personally through channels that Catherine Morrison knows nothing about." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. Marcus hadn't come here to investigate or to seize property on behalf of federal authorities. He'd come to deliver a message, to demonstrate that whatever game Weston thought he'd been playing, Marcus had been playing it better and longer. "You've set this up," Weston said quietly. "All of it?" "The railroad route information, Catherine's access to the documents, even Thomas Quinn's fraudulent activities. You orchestrated all of it. I capitalized on existing situations and guided them toward profitable conclusions. It's called business. Brother, perhaps you've heard of it?" Maybelle sank into the porch chair, the weight of understanding making her legs too weak to support her. "So my land isn't valuable after all. The partnership is based on false information. And my husband isn't missing. He's actively working to destroy whatever security I might have built." "I'm afraid the situation is even more complex than that," Marcus said with false sympathy. "Because while your land may not be needed for this railroad, it does sit on what geological surveys suggest could be significant mineral deposits. Copper, possibly silver. The kind of deposits that would be quite valuable to mining interests with federal connections. Mining interests like Carrick Enterprises. Mining interests like the companies that Carrick Enterprises partners with. Yes, which brings us to the real purpose of my visit tonight." Marcus signaled to his men, who began dismounting with the organized efficiency of a military operation. "I'm here to make you both an offer you'd be wise to consider carefully." The offer, when it came, was delivered with the clinical precision of a surgeon making an amputation. Marcus spread additional documents across the porch table that Miguel had built for Maybelle's evening meals, each paper representing another layer of the trap that had been closing around them for months without their knowledge. $10,000 for a full quitclaim to the property, Marcus said, his finger tracing the property boundaries on an official survey map. Plus guaranteed safe passage to any destination of your choosing, Mrs. Quinn, and a substantial settlement for the inconvenience of your current situation. Inconvenience. Maybelle's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried enough ice to freeze desert air. "Is that what you call destroying someone's life?" "I call it business. Regrettable, perhaps, but necessary." Marcus glanced at Weston, who had remained unnaturally still since the revelations began. "Of course, the alternative is a federal investigation. That could result in criminal charges for conspiracy to defraud the government, illegal acquisition of classified information, and a dozen other felonies that carry significant prison sentences." The baby kicked hard against Maybelle's ribs, as if responding to her elevated pulse and the stress that was making her hands shake despite her attempts to maintain composure. She pressed her palm against the movement, drawing what comfort she could from the reminder that whatever happened next, she wasn't facing it entirely alone. Prison sentences for whom? Weston asked quietly. For both of you, brother. Mrs. Quinn may not have known about the classified documents, but she's been the direct beneficiary of information obtained through federal corruption. In the eyes of the law, that makes her an accessory after the fact. She had no knowledge of how I obtained the information. Prove it. In court, to a federal judge who's been instructed that railroad development is a matter of national security. Marcus's smile was all sharp edges. I'm sure a pregnant woman would. Fare well in a federal prison while awaiting trial. The threat hung in the night air like gun smoke, and Maybelle felt something shift inside her chest. Not the baby's movement this time, but something harder and more determined. The fear that had been her constant companion for months was transforming into anger, and anger was an emotion she could work with. Dr. Hayes. She spoke the name suddenly, remembering something that had been nagging at the edges of her consciousness. I'm sorry? Marcus looked genuinely puzzled. Dr. Hayes, a traveling physician who comes through this territory every few months. He was here last week, and he mentioned something interesting. Maybelle stood slowly, her hand still pressed to her belly. He said there's been an unusual number of federal surveyors working in this area lately. Geological teams, railroad engineers, mining consultants, all working for different government agencies with overlapping jurisdictions. Your point? My point is that if there really are federal investigations and emergency seizure powers and all these official documents you keep producing, then Dr. Hayes would have been notified. He's the designated territorial medical officer, responsible for reporting any unusual federal activity to the territorial government. Maybelle's voice grew stronger as her logic developed. But he hasn't received any such notifications, which makes me wonder how official your authority really is. Marcus's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, but Weston caught it. She's right, isn't she? This isn't federal authority at all. This is you, using your business connections and political influence to create the appearance of official action. Does it matter? The end result is the same. You lose the property, and I acquire the mineral rights before anyone else realizes their value. It matters because fraud is still fraud, even when it's committed by someone with a federal contract in his pocket. The new voice came from the shadows beyond the yard, and all three of them turned toward it in surprise. Dr. Hayes emerged into the moonlight, leading a horse and carrying his ever-present medical bag. Behind him came Miguel Santos and three other members of Weston's construction crew, all armed and moving with the purposeful coordination of men who'd served in military units before finding work on ranches and building sites. Dr. Hayes, Maybelle said, relief flooding her voice. How did you? Miguel sent word when he saw the riders approaching. Thought there might be medical assistance needed before the night was over. The doctor's gaze moved over Marcus's mounted escort with professional assessment. Seems his instincts were correct. Marcus's hand moved toward his coat, but stopped when he realized that his 8-man advantage had suddenly become much less significant. Miguel's men had positioned themselves strategically around the yard, and the doctor was opening his medical bag to reveal a very non-medical Colt revolver. Now then, Dr. Hayes continued conversationally, Mrs. Quinn mentioned some concerns about federal authority and emergency seizure powers. As the designated territorial medical officer, I'm required to verify any federal activity that might affect the health and safety of territorial residents. Perhaps you gentlemen could provide some documentation? This is a private business matter, Marcus said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Involving threats against a pregnant woman and claims of federal authority to seize private property. That makes it very much my business. Dr. Hayes removed several more items from his bag bandages, a bottle of laudanum, and what looked suspiciously like a telegraph key. I took the liberty of sending a wire to the territorial capital before riding out here. Asked about any federal emergency powers or investigation orders involving this property. And no such orders exist. No federal investigations have been authorized. And the Railroad Commission has no record of emergency seizure powers being granted to private entities. The doctor's smile was pleasant and entirely professional, which means that whatever Mr. Marcus Carrick has been telling you tonight constitutes criminal impersonation of federal authority. The revelation struck the assembled group like lightning, and Maybelle saw several of Marcus's riders exchanging uncertain glances. Whatever they'd been told about the legitimacy of this operation, the doctor's words had introduced doubt into their calculations. "You're interfering with legitimate business operations," Marcus said, but his protest lacked conviction. "I'm protecting a patient from fraudulent threats and potential harm. Mrs. Quinn is in the advanced stages of pregnancy, and the stress of this confrontation could endanger both her health and that of her child." Dr. Hayes moved closer to Maybelle, his medical bag still conveniently open. "I'm ordering all non-essential personnel to vacate this property immediately." "On whose authority?" "On the authority of the territorial medical statute that grants physicians emergency powers to protect patient welfare." The doctor pulled out an official-looking document of his own. "I've just declared this property a medical emergency zone. Anyone who remains without medical justification will be subject to arrest for interference with emergency medical care." It was a masterful bluff, backed by just enough legal technicality to make Marcus uncertain about challenging it directly. More importantly, it gave his hired men an excuse to withdraw from what was looking increasingly like a doomed operation. "This isn't over," Marcus said, but he was already signaling for his men to remount. "No," Weston said quietly, speaking for the first time since the doctor's arrival. "It's not. Because tomorrow morning, I'm riding to the territorial capital to file formal complaints about attempted fraud, criminal impersonation of federal authority, and conspiracy to illegally seize private property. You'll also be filing complaints about your own illegal acquisition of classified information." "Yes, I will. And I'll face whatever consequences that brings. But at least I'll be facing them honestly, instead of hiding behind forged documents and manufactured authority." Marcus stared at his brother for a long moment, and Maybelle could see decades of rivalry and resentment passing between them like electric current. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice carried the cold promise of a man who viewed this as merely the first battle in a longer war. "You always were too sentimental for your own good, brother. Father warned me this would happen. Eventually, that you'd let emotions compromise your business judgment. Maybe Father was wrong about what constitutes good judgment. We'll see about that. This territory is changing, Weston. Railroad or no railroad, mineral deposits or no mineral deposits, the old ways of doing business are ending. You can either adapt to the new realities or be swept aside by them. And the new realities include threatening pregnant women and forging federal documents. The new realities include understanding that individual property rights can't be allowed to interfere with larger economic development. Mrs. Quinn's homestead claim may be legally valid, but legal validity is only as strong as the power that enforces it." With that ominous pronouncement, Marcus wheeled his horse and led his men back into the darkness, leaving behind an aftermath that felt more like the eye of a storm than its conclusion. Dr. Hayes waited until the hoofbeats had faded before returning, his gun to the medical bag, and approaching Maybelle with genuine professional concern. "Mrs. Quinn, I need to examine you. This kind of stress can trigger premature labor, especially this late in pregnancy." "I'm all right," she said, but even as she spoke, she felt a cramping sensation low in her belly that made her catch her breath. "No, you're not. Miguel, help me get her inside. Mr. Carrick, I'll need hot water and clean towels. And someone needs to ride to town and fetch Mrs. Martinez. If Mrs. Quinn goes into labor tonight, I'll need an experienced midwife." The cramping came again, stronger this time, and Maybelle realized that the night's revelations and confrontations had set in motion consequences that went far beyond business disputes and property claims. Her body was responding to the stress in the most primitive way possible, and suddenly all the questions about trust and betrayal and federal authority seemed less important than the immediate reality of bringing a child into a world that had just become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. "Weston," she said, as Miguel helped her toward the house, and something in her voice made him look up from where he'd been staring at the scattered documents Marcus had left behind. "I'm here. Whatever else has happened between us, whatever lies. And manipulations and broken trust, that ends now. This baby is coming, and when he arrives, he's going to need parents who can work together to protect him." "Parents?" The word seemed to surprise him. partners, parents, whatever we need to be. Another cramp doubled her over, and she gripped Miguel's arm for support. But if you want to be part of this child's life, then you need to decide right. Now, whether you're going to be the man your brother thinks you are, or the man I believed you could be, the choice hung between them, as stark and unavoidable as the desert sunrise. While inside the house, Dr. Hayes was already preparing for the trivia. Possibility that Marcus Carrick's midnight visit might have precipitated more than just the collapse of a fraudulent land scheme. The next contraction hit as they reached the bedroom, and Maybelle gripped the doorframe with enough force to leave marks in the wood. The pain was different from anything she'd experienced, not just the physical intensity, but the timing. It was too early, too sudden, driven by stress and fear rather than the natural progression she'd been expecting. "How long between contractions?" Dr. Hayes asked, his professional calm a steadying presence in the chaos of the evening. "Maybe 10 minutes, but they're getting stronger." Maybelle eased herself onto the bed, grateful for the quilts her mother had made and the simple comfort of familiar surroundings. "Is it too early? Will the baby be all right?" "We're close enough to term that the baby has a good chance, but we need to proceed carefully." The doctor was already washing his hands in the basin Weston had filled, his movements efficient and practiced. "The stress of tonight's events has likely triggered this, which means we need to keep you as calm as possible." "Calm." Maybelle managed a weak laugh between contractions. "My husband is alive and working with criminals. My partner has been lying to me for months, and armed men just threatened to steal my home. Calm might be asking too much. Then we'll focus on what we can control." Dr. Hayes dried his hands and began laying out supplies from his expanded medical kit. "Right now, that means bringing your child safely into the world." Weston appeared in the doorway, his arms full of clean towels and his face showing a mixture of determination and barely controlled panic. "Mrs. Martinez is on her way. Miguel's riding to town to fetch her." "Good. In the meantime, we'll need more hot water and adequate lighting." The doctor glanced at Weston with the assessing look of someone determining whether he be help or hindrance in a crisis. "Have you ever assisted with childbirth, Mr. Carrick?" "No, but I've delivered foals and calves." "I imagine the principles are similar enough. And given the circumstances, you may be our best option for additional hands." Dr. Hayes turned back to Maybelle as another contraction began building. "Mrs. Quinn, I need you to tell me exactly what you're feeling. Don't minimize the pain or try to be brave. I need accurate information." The contraction peaked, and Maybelle found herself reaching for Weston's hand without conscious thought. His fingers closed around hers with gentle strength, and she realized that whatever betrayals and deceptions had brought them to this moment, the connection between them in this crisis felt entirely real. "It's like being torn apart from the inside," she gasped as the pain subsided. "But it's not just the pain something feels wrong, different from what I expected." Dr. Hayes's examination was swift and professional, but Maybelle caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested concern. "The baby is breech. Not uncommon, but it complicates things, especially with premature labor." "Complicated how?" Weston's voice was steady, but she could feel the tension in his grip. "Breech deliveries require careful management to avoid injury to both mother and child. In a proper hospital, we might consider surgical intervention, but out here." The doctor paused, choosing his words carefully. "We'll need to work together and trust the process." Another contraction began, stronger than the previous ones, and Maybelle found herself bearing down instinctively before Dr. Hayes could stop her. "Not yet," he said firmly. "I know every instinct is telling you to push, but we need to wait until the positioning is right. Premature pushing with a breech presentation could cause complications we can't fix out here." "How long?" The question came out through gritted teeth as she fought against her body's demands. "As long as it takes. Breech babies come on their own schedule." Dr. Hayes moved to the window, checking the angle of the moonlight. "Mr. Carrick, we're going to need better illumination. Every lamp you can find, positioned safely around the bed." As Weston moved to gather lighting, Maybelle felt the full weight of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. Here she was, about to give birth to a child whose father had abandoned them both for a life of fraud and deception, with only a man she'd learned to trust despite his lies, and a country doctor whose medical bag had revealed itself to contain as many weapons as healing supplies. "Dr. Hayes," she said during a brief respite between contractions, "if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you. But if it does, I need to know that the baby will be protected. From Marcus Carrick, from my husband's criminal activities, from all of it." The doctor paused in his preparations to look at her directly. "Mrs. Quinn, that baby is going to have two parents who'll move heaven and earth to protect him, and a whole community of people who've watched you build something worthwhile from nothing. Whatever threats are out there, they'll have to go through all of us to reach him." Weston returned with an armload of lamps, his movements quick and efficient despite the obvious stress. "Mrs. Martinez should be here within the hour. Miguel's also sending word to the territorial marshal about Marcus's activities tonight." "Good. Thinking. We'll want official documentation of what happened here." Dr. Hayes positioned the lamps to provide maximum light without creating dangerous shadows. "Mrs. Quinn, the next contraction is going to be significant. I need you to focus on breathing through it, not fighting it." The contraction built like a wave, starting deep in her back and radiating forward with an intensity that made her previous experience seem mild by comparison. She squeezed Weston's hand and tried to follow the doctor's instructions about breathing, but the pain seemed to demand a more primitive response. "That's it," Dr. Hayes murmured, his hands gentle but sure as he monitored the baby's position. "I can see progress. The positioning is improving. Is that normal? The pain getting worse so quickly?" With stress-induced labor, everything tends to intensify faster than usual. Your body is responding to both the natural process and the adrenaline from tonight's events. The doctor's voice carried reassurance backed by professional experience. "The good news is that we're making progress. The difficult news is that the hardest part is still ahead." Between contractions, Maybelle found herself studying Weston's face in the lamplight, the carefully maintained composure he'd shown during the confrontation with Marcus had given way to something more raw and immediate: fear, determination, and what looked like a fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with business partnerships or land values. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why what? Why are you here? Really here, not just physically present, but committed to this? After everything that's been revealed tonight, you could walk away. Probably should walk away. So why aren't you?" Weston was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute honesty. "Because for the first time in my adult life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Whatever brought me. Here lies manipulation. Even genuine feeling, none of that matters as much as what's happening right now." Another contraction began building, and this time Dr. Hayes's expression showed cautious optimism. "Mrs. Quinn, I believe we're ready. The next few contractions should bring your baby into the world." "Should?" "Will," the doctor corrected with a confidence that steadied her nerves. "This baby is ready to be born, and you're ready to bring him safely home." As the contraction peaked, and she began the work of bringing new life into a world that had proven itself to be far more complicated and dangerous than she'd ever imagined, Maybelle felt something shift inside her understanding of what family meant. Not the legal arrangements and blood ties she'd grown up believing in, but something forged in crisis and sustained by choice, the decision to stand together when everything else fell apart. The baby's first cry cut through the desert night like a declaration of independence, strong and indignant and utterly alive. And in that moment, surrounded by lamplight and the gentle hands of people who'd chosen to be present for the miracle of new life, Maybelle understood that whatever came next, her child would never lack for people willing to fight for his future. The baby was perfect, smaller than full term, but with strong lungs and the determined cry of a fighter. Dr. Hayes worked with practiced efficiency, clearing the infant's airways and wrapping him in the soft blanket that Weston had pulled from his own shirt, torn into clean strips when the prepared linens had proven insufficient. "A son," the doctor announced, placing the bundled child in Maybelle's arms. "Small but healthy, with all the fight he'll need for this world." Maybelle looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled, but unmistakably alive, and felt something settle into place in her chest that had been loose and uncertain for months. This was what she'd been working toward, what all the struggle and isolation had been preparing her for, not just survival, but the creation of something precious and new that would outlast whatever troubles had brought them to this moment. "Hello, little one," she whispered, and the baby's crying softened as if responding to her voice. "You picked quite a night to make your entrance." Weston stood beside the bed, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, and his hands still bearing traces of his impromptu medical assistance. But his attention was focused entirely on the small bundle in Maybelle's arms, and his expression showed wonder mixed with something that looked like overwhelming responsibility. "What will you call him?" Dr. Hayes asked as he cleaned his instruments and packed away the supplies that had turned Maybelle's bedroom into a makeshift medical facility. "James," Maybelle said without hesitation. "James Samuel Quinn, after my father and my grandfather, men who knew how to build something lasting." "James Samuel," Weston repeated, testing the name. "A strong name for a boy who'll need strength." Before Maybelle could respond, the sound of hoofbeats in the yard announced Mrs. Martinez's arrival. The midwife burst through the front door with the bustling energy of a woman accustomed to emergencies, calling out in rapid Spanish as she hurried toward the bedroom. "Dios mío, the baby is already here?" She swept into the room like a maternal tornado, her experienced eyes taking in the scene and immediately focusing on the most important details. "How long ago? Any complications? Is the mother bleeding?" 40 minutes ago. Breech presentation but successful delivery. And Mrs. Quinn is doing well," Dr. Hayes reported with the efficient communication of medical professionals. "The baby appears healthy despite being about 3 weeks early." Mrs. Martinez moved to examine both mother and child with the gentle thoroughness of someone who'd delivered half the babies in the territory. Her hands were warm and sure, and her presence brought a maternal comfort that even Dr. Hayes's professional competence hadn't provided. "Pequego Guerrero," she murmured as she checked the baby's reflexes and breathing. "Little warrior, born fighting. That's good. He'll need that spirit." "Mrs. Martinez," Maybelle said, grateful for the woman's calming presence, "there may be trouble in the coming days. Legal problems, men who'll try to claim this property or challenge my right to stay here. I need to know that if something happens to me, nothing will happen to you," the midwife said firmly, but not dismissively. "But if trouble comes, Mia, you have friends. Miguel, Dr. Hayes, the other families who've watched you work this land. We don't abandon our own." "Our own?" The phrase carried weight that went beyond simple neighborliness. "You think we haven't been watching? Haven't seen how you've survived what would have broken lesser women? Haven't noticed how you've treated everyone with respect regardless of their station?" Mrs. Martinez finished her examination and returned the baby to Maybelle's arms. "You belong here, Nina. You and this beautiful boy." A commotion outside interrupted the moment voices, raised in urgent conversation, and the clatter of multiple horses arriving at speed. Weston moved to the window, his body tensing as he recognized the riders. "Marcus is back," he said quietly, "with more men this time. And they're not here for conversation." Dr. Hayes joined him at the window, and his professional calm gave way to something harder. "How many?" 15, maybe 20. Too many for us to handle if they're determined to. Use force." Mrs. Martinez's response was immediate and practical. "Then we don't fight them here. Not with a woman who just gave birth and a newborn baby." She moved to the wardrobe and began pulling out clothes. "There's a place, an old mining cabin in the hills behind the creek. Miguel showed it to me when we were planning for emergencies." "Emergencies like this?" "Emergencies like men who think they can take what doesn't belong to them." The midwife's voice carried steel beneath the maternal warmth. "Dr. Hayes, can Mrs. Quinn be moved safely?" "Not ideally, but given the circumstances." The doctor was already repacking his medical supplies. "With proper support and frequent rest stops, yes." Maybelle listened to them planning her escape with a mixture of gratitude and frustration. "I'm not running from my own home." "You're not running, Weston," said, moving away from the window to face her directly. "You're making a strategic withdrawal to protect your son. There's a difference, is there? Because it feels like letting Marcus win. Marcus has already lost. He revealed his hand tonight, showed that his authority was fraudulent, and made threats. In front of witnesses. The territorial marshal will have warrants issued within days." Weston's voice carried certainty backed by years of legal experience. "But warrants don't help us if he decides to settle this through violence instead of law." The baby stirred in Maybelle's arms, making the small sounds that newborns use to announce their needs, and the sight of his tiny face reminded her that this wasn't about pride or principle anymore. This was about ensuring that James Samuel Quinn lived to grow up on the land his mother had claimed for him. "The partnership papers," she said suddenly. "All the legal documents are in the house. If Marcus burns it down or destroys them, are safely filed with my lawyer in the territorial capital," Weston finished. "I'm not completely naive about my brother's methods. The original documents are protected, along with copies of all survey reports and property deeds." Outside, Marcus's voice carried clearly through the night air, no longer bothering with pretense or politeness. "Weston, I know you're in there. We need to finish our conversation." Mrs. Martinez handed Maybelle a bundle of warm clothes and practical supplies. "Can you ride, Mia? Side saddle, with the baby?" "If I have to." Maybelle's voice was stronger than she felt, but she was learning that strength could be borrowed when necessary. "You don't have to do this alone," Weston said, and she heard in his voice the man she'd hoped. He might be beneath all the complications of his background and business dealings. "Whatever my mistakes, whatever lies brought us together, I'm committed to seeing this through, to protecting you and James, and to being worthy of the trust you've shown me." As they prepared to slip out the back of the house, while Marcus and his men focused their attention on the front, Maybelle wrapped her son in the improvised blanket made from Weston's shirt, a piece of fine fabric, transformed into something more precious than its original purpose. It would be the first of many transformations in the child's life, she suspected, as luxury learned to serve love, and privilege discovered its true purpose in protection. The baby slept peacefully through the preparations for their escape, as if he understood that his life had begun in crisis, and that adapting to unexpected circumstances would be among his most valuable inherited traits. 6 months later, Maybelle stood on the front porch of a house that bore little resemblance to the ramshackle homestead where she'd once struggled alone. The new structure rose from foundations of local stone, its timber frame solid and true, built to withstand whatever storms the territory might bring. In her arms, James Samuel gurgled contentedly, his eyes bright with the curiosity of a child, discovering that the world was full of interesting things to explore. The sound of hammers still echoed from the construction site, where the final phase of improvements was taking shape, a proper schoolhouse that would serve not just their growing household, but the children of the families who'd begun settling in the valley as word spread about the opportunities here. Miguel supervised the work with the quiet pride of a man watching his vision take physical form, while his crew moved with the efficiency of workers who understood they were building something that would outlast them all. The territorial marshals. "Final report came in yesterday," Weston said, joining her on the porch with coffee and the comfortable ease of a man who'd found his place in the world. "Marcus has been charged with federal fraud, conspiracy, and criminal impersonation of government authority. The trial is set for next month in the territorial capital. Will you testify?" "If necessary, though I suspect his own forged documents will provide sufficient evidence." Weston settled into the chair beside her, his movements careful to avoid disturbing the baby's contentment. "The Railroad Commission has also issued their final route determination. The southern line through Hartwell's old spread will be the primary route, with a spur line running north to connect with our property." Our property. The word still carried wonder, even after months of legal certainty. "Our property," he confirmed. "Equal partners, as agreed. Though the mineral surveys suggest the real value will be in the copper deposits, not railroad access." James made a small sound of protest as a hawk circled overhead, and Maybelle adjusted his position so he could see the bird without being startled by its shadow. At 6 months, he showed all the signs of the determined spirit that had brought him safely. into the world during that chaotic night. He slept well, ate with enthusiasm, and regarded the world around him with the alert attention of someone planning to make his mark on it. "Dr. Hayes says he's developing perfectly," Maybelle said, responding to Weston's unspoken question about the baby's health. "Strong, bright, and showing no lasting effects from the early birth." "And his mother?" "Any lasting effects from that night? Some, but not the kind you're worried about." She looked at him directly, seeing the man who'd proven himself through months of patient work and consistent presence. "I trust more carefully now, ask more questions. But I also understand better what's worth fighting for." The transformation in both of them had been gradual but unmistakable. Weston had stepped away from the more questionable aspects of his business empire, focusing instead on development projects that benefited entire communities rather than just corporate investors. Maybelle had discovered that strength could coexist with partnership, that accepting help didn't require surrendering independence. "Speaking of what's worth fighting for," Weston said, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw a small velvet box, "I have something I've been meaning to discuss with you." Maybelle felt her breath catch, recognizing the significance of the moment, even as her practical mind raced through implications and possibilities. "Weston, I know this is complicated. I know we've built our partnership on business principles and practical considerations. But somewhere in the past months, those considerations have become secondary to something more important." He opened the box to reveal a ring, not the elaborate diamond she might have expected from a man of his means, but a simple band of gold set with a stone, the deep blue of desert twilight. "I'm not asking you to marry me because it would be convenient or profitable or because James needs a father's name. I'm asking because I can't imagine building the rest of my life with anyone else." The baby chose that moment to reach for the open ring box, his small fingers grasping at the pretty object with single-minded determination. The gesture broke the tension and reminded them both that whatever decision they made would shape not just their own futures, but the future of the child who'd already brought them closer together than either had expected. "It's beautiful," Maybelle said, studying the ring and the man offering it. "But I need you to understand something. If I say yes, it won't be because I need rescue or protection or financial security. It'll be because I choose to build something with you that's stronger than what either of us could build alone. That's all I want. Partnership in the truest sense. Two people choosing to face whatever comes next together." She looked out over the valley where their combined efforts had created something remarkable. The land that had once been her desperate last hope had become a thriving operation that provided employment for a dozen families and promise for many more. The house where she'd once struggled alone now rang with the voices of friends and workers and the everyday sounds of a community taking root. "Yes," she said simply, and slipped the ring onto her finger beside the simple gold band she'd worn throughout her marriage to Thomas Quinn. "But I'm keeping both rings. The first one reminds me where I came from. This one reminds me where I'm going." As Weston leaned over to kiss her, James Samuel made a sound of approval that might have been coincidence, but felt like blessing. In the distance, the sound of hammers continued as the schoolhouse took shape, and somewhere in the hills, the creek ran full with snowmelt from the mountains, carrying the promise of another good year for the land they'd claimed together. Foundation stones that would support their new life had been laid not in romance or easy promises, but in the harder work of choosing trust over fear, partnership over independence, and commitment over convenience. It was a foundation built to last, strong enough to support whatever storms might come, and flexible enough to grow with the changing needs of the family they'd created through choice rather than blood. That evening, as the construction crew headed home and the desert stars emerged in their ancient patterns, Maybelle and Weston sat on their porch and planned the wedding. That would make their partnership official in the eyes of both law and community. James Samuel slept peacefully in the cradle that had been his first gift from the man who'd become his father through commitment rather than biology, wrapped in quilts that told the story of 3 generations of women who'd known how to build homes from hope and determination. In the growing darkness, their voices carried the quiet confidence of people who tested their partnership against real challenges and found it strong enough to build a future on. Whatever came next, railroad development, mining ventures, the inevitable complications of raising a child in a territory still finding its identity, they would face it together, as equals, as partners, as a family forged in crisis and strengthened. By choice, the land that had once seemed like the end of the world had become its beginning.